The silence on the interstate at 2 a.m. was broken when I noticed those headlights in my rearview mirror, the same ones that had been following me for 30 miles, matching every lane change, every speed adjustment. When I took the next exit just to test my growing paranoia, they followed. And I realized whoever was behind me wasn't just driving the same direction, they were hunting me. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Verified Fears family as we explore 11 spine-chilling road trip stories that will make you think twice about traveling alone. I realized something was wrong when I pulled into the rest area at mile marker 125 on Interstate 80 in Nevada and saw the same blue sedan that had been behind me for the last 47 miles. Slowly cruised past the entrance, its driver staring directly at me through tinted windows. That sedan had maintained the exact same following distance since I'd left the Fernley truck stop, matching my speed changes so perfectly that I'd started timing it. Every time I slowed down, they slowed down exactly 3 seconds later. And when I accelerated, they accelerated with the same delay, like they were connected to my car by an invisible string. The Nevada Department of Transportation rest area at mile 125 sits in the middle of absolute nowhere between Lovelock and Winnemucca. One of those bare-bones facilities with just restrooms, a couple of picnic tables, and a parking lot surrounded by endless sagebrush and distant mountains. I'd been driving straight through from Sacramento to my sister's place in Salt Lake City, taking Interstate 80 across the Nevada desert because it was the most direct route. Even though everyone warned me about how monotonous and isolated that stretch could be. The plan was simple: drive through the night to avoid the desert heat. Maybe catch some sleep at a truck stop and be in Utah by morning. But plans have a way of going sideways when you're alone on a highway where cell towers are spaced 50 miles apart and the next town might as well be on another planet. It started around Fernley, just after I'd topped off my gas tank and grabbed a coffee at the Love's travel stop on Truck Inn Way. I'd been making good time, cruising at a steady 75 on the mostly empty interstate, when I noticed the blue sedan merge onto I-80 from the US 95 interchange. At first, it was just another car on the road. Nothing unusual about that. But as the miles ticked by and the traffic thinned out to almost nothing, that sedan remained constant in my rearview mirror, maintaining the same distance whether I was doing 70 or 85. I told myself it was coincidence, that plenty of people drive this route at night to avoid the heat. But when I slowed to 65 to test my theory, the sedan slowed too. And when I sped back up to 80, it matched my speed with mechanical precision. The desert landscape rolling past my windows looked like something from another world. Vast expanses of scrub brush and rocky outcroppings broken only by the occasional cluster of lights, marking some isolated ranch or mining operation. Mile markers counted down the distance to Winnemucca. On a 50, 140, 135, each one confirming that I was getting deeper into the kind of emptiness where help might be hours away if something went wrong. The sedan stayed with me through every gentle curve and long straightaway, never attempting to pass, never falling behind, just maintaining that same precise distance like a shadow attached to my bumper. By the time I reached mile marker 130, my hands were starting to shake on the steering wheel, and I knew I needed to do something to break this pattern. That's when I saw the brown highway sign announcing the rest area ahead, and I made a split-second decision to pull off and see what would happen. The sedan continued past the entrance, but slowly, deliberately, and I caught a glimpse of the driver. A figure in dark clothing whose face was obscured by the angle in the tinted windows. My heart was pounding as I parked near the restrooms, the only other vehicle in the lot being a semi-truck with California plates whose driver was nowhere to be seen. I sat in my car for several minutes, engine running, watching the entrance and telling myself I was being paranoid, that the sedan was probably just coincidentally traveling the same route at the same time. But then I saw the headlights approaching from the east, coming back toward the rest area. And I knew with cold certainty that the blue sedan had turned around somewhere down the highway. I watched through my windshield as it slowed at the rest area entrance, then continued past again, this time even more slowly. The driver's side window rolling down just enough for me to see the pale outline of a face turned in my direction. The sedan disappeared into the darkness toward Winnemucca. But I knew it would be back. This felt like some kind of reconnaissance, like whoever was in that car was studying the layout, planning their next move. The rest area sat in a pool of sickly yellow light from the overhead sodium lamps, casting long shadows between the picnic tables and making the surrounding desert look like an endless black void. The restroom building was one of those standard concrete block structures you find at highway stops across the American West. Functional, but not inviting, especially at 2 in the morning when you're the only person around. I could hear the distant rumble of a truck engine idling somewhere in the darkness. But I couldn't see the driver, and the isolation felt overwhelming. Every small sound, the wind rustling through the sagebrush, the creak of a picnic table, the distant howl of a coyote, seemed amplified in the desert silence. I tried calling 911, but my phone showed no signal, which wasn't surprising given how remote this stretch of I-80 is. The nearest town of any size was Winnemucca, still 35 miles to the east, and Lovelock was about the same distance behind me to the west. I was truly on my own out here, and that realization made my situation feel exponentially more dangerous. The semi-truck driver was my only potential source of help, but I had no idea where he was. Maybe sleeping in his cab, maybe in the restroom. Maybe he'd walked off into the darkness for reasons I didn't want to contemplate. That's when the blue sedan returned, this time approaching from the west, from the direction of Lovelock. It pulled into the rest area entrance and parked at the far end of the lot, maybe 60 yards away from my car, positioning itself between me and the exit back to the highway. The headlights went out, but the engine kept running, and I could see the faint glow of the interior light as the driver did something inside the car, checking something, preparing something. I didn't know what. The distance between us felt both too far for me to see clearly what was happening and too close for comfort, especially with the desert stretching endlessly in all directions and no help available for miles. I made a decision that probably saved my life. I started my engine and drove straight toward the blue sedan. Not aggressively, but purposefully. Like I was heading for the highway entrance. The sedan's headlights immediately came on, and it began backing up toward the exit. But I had momentum and the angle, and I managed to get between the sedan and the highway before it could block me in completely. As I accelerated up the on-ramp back onto Interstate 80, I saw in my rearview mirror that the sedan had stopped in the rest area parking lot, and the driver had gotten out, a tall figure in dark clothing who stood motionless beside the car, watching me disappear into the night. I drove the remaining 170 miles to the Utah border without stopping, not even when my gas gauge dropped to nearly empty and I was praying I'd make it to the next truck stop. The blue sedan never reappeared in my mirrors, but I kept checking obsessively, and I didn't feel safe until I saw the lights of West Wendover on the Nevada-Utah border and pulled into the first 24-hour gas station I could find. Even then, as I filled my tank under the bright fluorescent lights with other travelers coming and going around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkness of the Nevada desert, that sedan was still out there, still looking for its next victim on the lonely stretches of Interstate 80 where help is hours away and cell phone signals are nothing but wishful thinking. I knew I was being watched the moment I stepped out of my car at the rest area near mile marker 59 on Interstate 35, about 20 miles south of Davis, Oklahoma. But it wasn't until I walked toward the restroom building that I realized the eyes following me belonged to more than one person. The feeling started as just an uncomfortable prickle between my shoulder blades. The kind of awareness you get when someone's staring at you from across a crowded room. But this was different. This felt predatory, calculated, like I was being evaluated by multiple sets of eyes hidden in the darkness beyond the yellow pools of sodium light. I'd been driving north from Dallas to Kansas City on Interstate 35, making the long haul through the night to avoid the brutal Texas heat and heavy traffic, when fatigue finally caught up with me just past the Red River crossing into Oklahoma. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:17 a.m. when I spotted the brown highway sign announcing the rest area ahead. And I figured a quick bathroom break and maybe a 5-minute power nap would be enough to get me through the remaining 3 hours to my destination. Oklahoma's I-35 corridor isn't exactly known for its abundance of rest facilities. The state has been systematically closing rest areas over the years, leaving travelers with fewer and fewer safe options for overnight stops. The rest area, at mile marker 59, sits in a particularly isolated stretch of south-central Oklahoma, surrounded by rolling hills covered in scrub oak and thick stands of eastern red cedar that create deep shadows even in daylight. During the day, you can see for miles across the gently undulating landscape. But at night, those same hills and tree lines become perfect concealment for anyone who doesn't want to be seen. The facility itself is one of those basic Oklahoma Department of Transportation setups, a small parking lot with spaces for maybe 20 cars, a concrete block restroom building, a couple of picnic tables, and an RV dump station that hadn't been maintained in years. When I pulled into the rest area, mine was the only passenger vehicle in the lot, though I noticed a dark-colored pickup truck parked at the far end near the tree line, positioned so that it was mostly hidden in shadows. The truck had been there when I arrived. Engine off, no movement visible inside. But something about its placement felt deliberate, like whoever was in it wanted to observe without being observed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that plenty of people used rest areas for legitimate overnight parking, especially truck drivers and travelers on long-distance trips. But as I walked across the asphalt toward the restroom building, I became increasingly aware that I wasn't alone. The sensation of being watched intensified with every step, and I found myself unconsciously scanning the perimeter of the rest area, looking for movement in the shadows beyond the reach of the overhead lights. The Oklahoma countryside stretched endlessly in all directions, dark, rolling hills dotted with isolated farmhouses whose distant porch lights looked like tiny stars scattered across a black canvas. If someone meant me harm out here, I was at least 30 miles from the nearest town of any size, and my cell phone showed only 1 bar of signal strength. Inside the restroom, I noticed that one of the ceiling lights was flickering intermittently, casting strange moving shadows on the concrete walls and making it difficult to see clearly into the corners. The building smelled of industrial disinfectant mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. As I used the facilities, I kept listening for sounds from outside, but all I could hear was the constant hum of the ventilation system and the occasional distant rumble of a semi-truck passing by on I-35. When I finished and pushed open the heavy metal door to leave, I was startled to see that 2 more vehicles had arrived while I was inside. Both dark-colored sedans that had parked on opposite sides of my car, effectively boxing me in. The occupants of these vehicles weren't visible, but I could tell the cars were occupied because I could see the faint glow of interior lights and the occasional movement of shadows inside. My heart rate spiked as I realized that my car was now surrounded, and I was standing alone in the middle of a deserted rest area in rural Oklahoma with no help available for miles. The dark pickup truck I'd noticed earlier was still in its original position near the tree line. But now I could see that its occupant had moved to the driver's seat and the engine was running, exhaust visible in the cool night air. I tried to act casual as I walked back toward my car. But every instinct I had was screaming that something was very wrong. The two sedans had positioned themselves in a way that would make it difficult for me to back out of my parking space without maneuvering around them. And I noticed that both vehicles had out-of-state license plates, one from Arkansas, the other from Texas, which struck me as odd, given how remote this particular rest area was. As I approached my car, I heard the distinct sound of multiple car doors opening almost simultaneously, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. I didn't turn around to see how many people had gotten out of the vehicles, but I could hear at least 3 distinct sets of footsteps moving in my direction, not running, but walking with purpose. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my car keys, and I made a split-second decision that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to get into my car, which would have required turning my back on whoever was approaching, I sprinted toward the highway, heading for the on-ramp back to Interstate 35. Behind me, I heard the footsteps break into a run, and someone shouted something I couldn't make out over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The distance from the rest area to the highway seemed infinite as I ran through the darkness, stumbling over uneven ground and small rocks, with the sound of pursuit getting closer behind me. Just as I reached the edge of the on-ramp, I saw the headlights of a northbound semi-truck approaching, and I did something I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I ran directly into the path of that 18-wheeler, waving my arms frantically to get the driver's attention. The truck's air brakes screamed as it came to a stop just a few feet from where I was standing, and the driver, a middle-aged woman with concerned eyes, immediately understood that I was in trouble. She let me climb up into the cab and used her CB radio to contact the Oklahoma Highway Patrol, describing the situation and requesting immediate assistance at the mile marker 59 rest area. As we waited for law enforcement to arrive, sitting in the idling truck with the engine running and the doors locked, I could see multiple sets of headlights moving around in the rest area parking lot before eventually leaving the scene, heading in different directions on various local roads that branched off from the interstate. By the time the state troopers arrived 20 minutes later, the rest area was completely empty except for my abandoned car. But the investigating officers found evidence of at least 4 different vehicles having been parked there recently, along with what appeared to be surveillance equipment hidden in the tree line. The trooper who interviewed me explained that this particular rest area had been flagged as a location of interest in connection with several missing person cases involving lone travelers on I-35. But they'd never been able to establish a clear pattern or gather enough evidence to make arrests. He recommended that I avoid using isolated rest areas during overnight hours and suggested sticking to well-lit truck stops and travel centers with security cameras and multiple witnesses present. As I drove away from that rest area, escorted by a patrol car to ensure my safety, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to becoming another missing person statistic on a stretch of Oklahoma highway, where screams for help would echo unheard across miles of empty countryside. The first thing I noticed about the Restwell Motel wasn't the peeling paint on its faded sign or the broken neon letters that flickered weakly against the Kansas thunderstorm, but the fact that there were no other cars in the parking lot, despite the clerk insisting they were completely booked for the night. Room 7 sat at the far end of the single-story building, isolated from the office and surrounded by darkness that seemed to swallow the weak light from the flickering overhead bulb outside my door. and as I inserted the old-fashioned metal key into the lock, I heard what sounded like muffled conversation coming from inside the room. I'd been driving west on Interstate 70 from Kansas City toward Denver when the storm hit just past Salina, bringing sheets of rain so heavy that I could barely see the taillights of the car ahead of me. The Weather Service had issued severe thunderstorm warnings for central Kansas, and when marble-sized hail started pounding my windshield near the Russell exit, I knew I needed to find shelter fast. The Restwell Motel appeared through the storm like a mirage. Its vintage 1960s sign advertising clean rooms, color TV, air conditioning, in letters that had probably been bright and inviting decades ago, but now looked tired and desperate in the intermittent lightning. The motel sat on the north side of I-70 near mile marker 184, about 15 miles west of Russell and 30 miles east of Hayes, in that lonely stretch of central Kansas where the highway cuts through endless wheat fields and scattered farmsteads. During daylight hours, you can see for miles across the gently rolling prairie. But at midnight, in a thunderstorm, the landscape disappears into a wall of black, punctuated only by the occasional flash of lightning revealing the skeletal forms of grain elevators and abandoned farmhouses. The motel's office was housed in a small building attached to the first room, with a hand-painted sign that read, "Office," hanging crooked on a chain. The desk clerk was an elderly man with thick glasses and nervous hands, who seemed surprised to see me, even though I'd called ahead from Russell to confirm they had availability. He kept glancing toward the back room while he processed my registration, and I could hear what sounded like a television or radio playing at low volume, though the words were too muffled to make out clearly. When I asked about restaurants or convenience stores nearby, he shook his head and explained that everything in the area closed by 9 o'clock, leaving travelers dependent on the vending machines outside the office or whatever snacks they'd brought with them. The storm intensified as I carried my overnight bag from the car to room 7. The wind driving rain horizontally across the parking lot and making it difficult to walk in a straight line. Lightning illuminated the motel's L-shaped layout, 12 rooms total, with mine positioned at the far end where the building turned 90 degrees toward a line of overgrown cottonwood trees that marked an old creek bed. As I approached my door, I noticed that several of the other rooms had lights on behind drawn curtains, which contradicted the empty parking lot, unless guests were parking their vehicles elsewhere or had arrived by other means. But it was the sound coming from inside room 7 that made my blood run cold. Voices, definitely human voices, speaking in hushed tones, as if they were trying not to be overheard. I stood outside the door for several minutes, key in hand, listening to what sounded like at least 2 people having a conversation, though I couldn't make out specific words over the noise of the storm. The voices would pause occasionally, as if listening for something, then resume their quiet discussion. I knocked on the door and called out, "Hello?" But the voices immediately stopped, followed by complete silence, except for the rain, drumming on the roof and the creak of the building settling in the wind. When I finally unlocked the door and stepped inside, the room was empty and felt like it had been unoccupied for hours. The air was stale and cold. The bed sheets were turned down as if housekeeping had prepared the room, but no one had used it. And there was a musty smell of disuse mixed with industrial carpet cleaner. I checked the bathroom, the closet, and even looked under the bed. But there was no sign that anyone had been in the room recently. The window was locked from the inside, and there was no connecting door to adjacent rooms. So I couldn't explain how the voices I'd heard could have disappeared so completely. The television was an old CRT model from the 1990s, and when I turned it on to check for local weather updates, it only received 3 channels with poor reception. all showing late-night programming that seemed oddly inappropriate for a family motel. Grainy, black-and-white movies that looked like they'd been filmed decades earlier. The air conditioning unit rattled and wheezed, but barely cooled the room. And the single overhead light cast harsh shadows that made everything look stark and unwelcoming. I tried calling the front desk to report the strange voices, but the phone in my room wasn't working, producing only a dial tone that sounded wrong somehow. Too high-pitched and electronic. Around 2 a.m., the voices returned, this time seeming to come from the walls themselves rather than from people physically present in the room. I could hear distinct conversations about things that made no sense. References to events that hadn't happened yet. Discussions of people I'd never heard of. And occasional mentions of room numbers and guest names that the desk clerk might have access to, but couldn't possibly know in such detail. The voices described other travelers who had stayed at the motel over the years, recounting their personal information, their reasons for traveling, and intimate details about their lives that no stranger could know. What terrified me most was when I heard my own name mentioned, along with accurate details about my trip to Denver, my job, and even private thoughts I'd had during the drive that I'd never spoken aloud. The voices discussed my arrival at the motel as if they'd been watching me, describing my conversation with the desk clerk word for word, and commenting on my reactions to the storm and my decision to stop for the night. They seemed to know things about me that I'd never shared with anyone, including childhood memories and fears that I'd kept buried for years. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my car in the parking lot with the engine running and the doors locked, afraid to go back into room 7, but equally afraid to drive in the continuing storm. The rain finally stopped around dawn, and as the sun came up over the Kansas prairie, I could see that the motel looked even more run down in daylight. Several rooms had boards over the windows. The swimming pool was empty and filled with debris, and weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot asphalt. When I went to the office to check out, a different clerk was on duty, a young woman who had no record of my registration and claimed the motel had been closed for renovations for the past 6 months. As I drove away on I-70 toward Hayes, I looked back at the Restwell Motel one last time and saw that room 7's door was standing wide open, revealing darkness inside even though the morning sun was shining directly into the doorway. I never found any online reviews or official records of the motel's existence, and when I drove back through that area 6 months later, there was nothing but an empty lot overgrown with prairie grass and a faded concrete foundation that might have once supported a building. But sometimes, late at night when I'm staying in other motels during long road trips, I still hear those voices discussing travelers and their secrets. And I wonder if the Restwell Motel was ever really there at all, or if some places exist only when desperate travelers need shelter from storms that might be more than just weather. My GPS died exactly 3 seconds before I realized the road I'd been following for the past 20 minutes didn't exist on any official map of Montana. The unmarked gravel path stretched ahead through dense lodgepole pine forest, disappearing around a bend where afternoon shadows turned the woods into something dark and impenetrable. And my fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank, with no memory of when I'd last seen another vehicle or any sign of civilization. The whole mess started that morning when I'd taken what looked like a shortcut off Highway 2 near Kalispell, trying to shave an hour off my drive to Glacier National Park before the weather turned. I'm usually pretty methodical about these things. Double-check routes, keep the tank full, stick to main highways when traveling alone. But something about the morning had made me feel reckless, maybe confident, like the kind of person who takes unmarked forest roads just to see where they lead. The detour had seemed innocent enough at first. A well-maintained dirt road marked only by a weathered wooden sign that read, Forest Service Road 486, no winter maintenance, in faded letters that I'd barely bothered to read completely. For the first 10 miles, everything felt perfectly normal. The road wound through typical northwestern Montana landscape of dense forest, broken by occasional meadows where wildflowers bloomed in patches of sunlight that filtered through the canopy overhead. I passed a few Forest Service markers and what looked like hunting trail access points, the kind of infrastructure that suggested this was a legitimate, if lesser-used, route through the Flathead National Forest. My phone had shown 3 bars of signal when I'd started, enough to stream music and check messages. But somewhere around mile 12, the signal had dropped to nothing, then disappeared entirely as the road climbed higher into country that felt increasingly remote. That's when I should have turned around, but the road kept promising that civilization was just around the next bend. There would be a wider spot that looked like maybe it led somewhere important, or a trail marker that suggested I was getting closer to a main hiking area where other people might be found. The trees pressed closer to the road as I climbed, creating a tunnel effect that made it difficult to judge distances or get any sense of where I was in relation to the landmarks I'd seen on the map before leaving the highway. Time seemed to stretch in weird ways when you're driving through forest that all looks the same, where every turn reveals more of the same dense pine and scattered deadfall. When the GPS finally gave up and displayed that dreaded "no route found" message, I pulled over at what might have been a widened spot in the road, or might have been just a place where the forest had been cleared for no reason I could determine. The silence outside my car was absolute. Not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful afternoon, but the heavy, waiting silence of a place where sound seems to get swallowed by the trees before it can travel more than a few feet. I tried restarting the GPS, checking my phone for any trace of signal, even getting out of the car to see if I could spot any familiar landmarks through breaks in the forest canopy. But there was nothing except endless trees stretching in every direction. The road behind me looked identical to the road ahead, and I realized with growing anxiety that I had no clear memory of the specific turns I'd made to get to this point. Forest roads have a way of branching and merging without clear signage, and what had seemed like one continuous route might have actually been several different roads that I'd followed without paying close enough attention to the junctions. Every mile I'd driven deeper into this maze had made my situation exponentially more complicated. And now I was faced with the choice of continuing forward on a road that might lead nowhere, or attempting to backtrack through a route I couldn't clearly remember. I decided to keep going forward, reasoning that most forest roads eventually connect to something: a highway, a ranger station, a campground, some kind of destination that would put me back on familiar ground. But as the afternoon wore on and my fuel gauge continued dropping toward empty, the road seemed to become less maintained, more like an old logging track than an official Forest Service route. The gravel gave way to packed dirt with deeper ruts, and I had to slow down to navigate around fallen branches and washouts that suggested this road hadn't seen regular maintenance in years. The trees began changing too, from the mixed pine and fir forest I'd been driving through to stands of older growth that blocked out more of the sky, creating a premature twilight effect even though it was still mid-afternoon. I started noticing things that seemed wrong: trail markers that didn't match any system I was familiar with, numbered posts that seemed to count down rather than up, and occasional clearings where the stumps looked like they'd been cut with something other than modern logging equipment. The wrongness was subtle but persistent, like being in a place where the normal rules didn't quite apply. When I finally saw the building ahead, my first reaction was relief. Any structure meant human presence, maybe someone who could give me directions or at least confirm where I was. But as I got closer, I could see that the building was abandoned. Probably had been for decades. It was a single-story log structure with a collapsed roof and windows that had been boarded up with plywood that was now weathered gray and pulling away from the frames. A sign that might once have identified the building was too faded to read, and the parking area was overgrown with vegetation that suggested no vehicles had been there in years. But my car wasn't the only one there. Parked behind the abandoned building, partially hidden by overgrown brush, were 3 other vehicles: a pickup truck, a sedan, and an SUV that all looked like they'd been sitting there for months or even years. The license plates were from different states and different decades. The oldest one I could make out was from the early 2000s, and all of them showed signs of long exposure to weather and neglect. Windows were clouded with condensation, tires were flat, and vegetation had grown up around the wheel wells in a way that suggested these vehicles had become permanent fixtures of the landscape. I sat in my car with the engine running, staring at those abandoned vehicles and trying to process what they meant. Other people had followed this same road, had arrived at this same destination, and for whatever reason, had never left. The logical explanation was mechanical failure. Cars break down, people abandon them and find other ways home, and over time the forest reclaims what gets left behind. But something about the scene felt deliberate, arranged, like these vehicles had been collected rather than coincidentally stranded. And the thought that I might be joining this automotive graveyard made my hands shake as I put my car in reverse and began backing away from the building as quickly as the rutted road would allow. They say you never forget the smell of human fear. And standing outside that gas station in the middle of nowhere, Arizona at 3 a.m, I finally understood what they meant. The metallic tang in the air mixed with gasoline fumes and something else. Something wrong that made my stomach clench with the same instinct that keeps animals away from poisoned water. I'd been driving through the night from Phoenix to Flagstaff on Highway 17, taking the back route through the desert. Because I needed time to think, time to process what I discovered about my business partner's financial irregularities that afternoon. Sometimes you need miles of empty road and star-filled sky to make sense of betrayal. And the desert highways of central Arizona provide exactly that kind of solitude. The radio had been playing classic rock for the past hour, keeping me company through the long stretches between scattered towns, when my fuel light came on, just past the tiny settlement of Black Canyon City. The gas station appeared like a mirage in my headlights. A single-story building with 2 pumps under flickering fluorescent lights that cast sickly yellow pools on cracked asphalt. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. With hand-painted signs advertising cold drinks and ice in faded letters that spoke of decades under the brutal Arizona sun. No other cars were visible, which wasn't unusual for this time of night, on a road that most travelers avoid in favor of the interstate. But something about the emptiness felt deliberate rather than coincidental. The building sat alone in a landscape of creosote bush and palo verde trees, surrounded by the kind of darkness that only exists in the desert, where the nearest neighbor might be 20 miles away. And the silence is so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. I pulled up to the pump closest to the building and shut off the engine, immediately noticing that the usual sounds of a functioning gas station were absent. No hum of refrigeration units, no background music from inside the store, no electronic beeping from payment terminals. When I tried to start the pump, nothing happened. No digital display, no request for payment method, no response to pressing any of the buttons on the faded interface. I walked around to the other pump with the same result. And that's when I noticed the handwritten sign taped to the door of the building. Pay inside, cash only, attendant required. The lettering was shaky, like it had been written by someone with unsteady hands, and the tape holding it in place was yellowed with age. Through the grimy windows, I could see the interior of the store dimly lit by what looked like a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with the usual assortment of snacks and automotive supplies. But everything looked dusty and undisturbed, like inventory that had been sitting there for months without anyone buying anything. Behind the counter, I could make out the silhouette of someone sitting motionless, and I knocked on the glass door to get their attention. The figure behind the counter didn't move, didn't acknowledge my knocking, didn't show any sign of having heard me despite the sound echoing clearly in the desert silence. I tried the door handle and found it unlocked, so I pushed it open and stepped inside, immediately hit by that smell. Fear mixed with something else, something organic and sweet that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. The air inside felt thick and wrong, like it hadn't been properly ventilated in weeks. "Excuse me," I called out to the person behind the counter, but my voice seemed to die in the stale air without carrying the way sound should in an enclosed space. As I got closer, I could see that the attendant was an elderly man slumped in a chair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his skin waxy and gray in the dim light. His eyes were open but vacant, staring at something beyond the far wall, and his mouth hung slightly open, as if he'd been trying to speak when whatever happened to him had happened. I backed away from the counter, my mind trying to process what I was seeing while my instincts screamed at me to get out of there immediately. The man was clearly dead, had been dead for some time based on his appearance. But the store was still unlocked, the lights were still on, and there was no smell of decay that should have been overwhelming in this heat. Instead, that metallic fear smell seemed to be getting stronger. And I realized it wasn't coming from the dead attendant. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the building. That's when I heard the sound from the back room. Not quite a voice, not quite mechanical, but something that might have been either or both. It was a low, rhythmic sound, like breathing, but too regular to be human, too organic to be machinery. The sound had a wet quality that made my skin crawl, and it seemed to be responding to my presence, getting slightly louder and more frequent as I stood there listening. I should have run then, should have gotten back in my car and driven until I found another gas station or run out of fuel trying. But something about the situation held me frozen in place. The dead attendant, the functioning lights, the unlocked door, the sound from the back room. None of it made sense in a way that suggested rational explanation. This felt like a place where normal rules had been suspended, where something had taken up residence that didn't belong in the daylight world of commerce and highway travel. The breathing sound from the back room changed rhythm, becoming more excited, more anticipatory. And I realized that whatever was making it knew I was there and was pleased about my presence. The fear smell in the air intensified until it was almost choking, and I understood with terrible clarity that I wasn't the first traveler to stop at this gas station in the night. Wasn't the first person to discover the dead attendant and investigate the sounds from the back room. I forced myself to move, to back slowly toward the door while keeping my eyes on the entrance to the back room, expecting at any moment to see something emerge that would explain the sounds and the smell and the dead man behind the counter. But nothing appeared, and the breathing continued its wet, rhythmic pattern, sometimes pausing as if listening, then resuming with what sounded almost like satisfaction. Outside, my hands shook as I tried to start my car, the engine turning over slowly in the desert heat before finally catching and roaring to life. As I pulled away from the gas station, I looked back in my rearview mirror and saw that the lights in the building had gone out, all of them at once, leaving the place in complete darkness. But the breathing sound followed me for miles down the highway, carried on the desert wind through my open windows, reminding me that some places exist outside the normal world of maps and highway signs. Places where travelers disappear and attendants die at their posts while something inhuman takes up residence in the shadows, waiting patiently for the next desperate motorist to stop for fuel in the middle of the Arizona night. The state trooper pulled me over exactly 14 miles from where I'd left the cult compound, and the moment I saw his face in my side mirror, I knew they'd already gotten to him. His eyes held that same vacant stare I'd seen in the gas station attendants back in Redemption, Arizona, a little desert town that doesn't appear on most maps but should, because people need to know what's waiting for them there behind those sun-bleached buildings and hand-painted signs advertising salvation. I'd been running for 3 days straight, ever since I'd escaped from the compound during the chaos of what they called the cleansing ceremony. Driving my battered Honda Civic through back roads and desert highways with nothing but the clothes on my back and a wallet containing $47 in cash. The whole nightmare had started innocently enough. A wrong turn off Interstate 40 near Flagstaff when I was driving from Los Angeles to Albuquerque for my cousin's wedding. Following a detour sign that led me down increasingly remote roads until I found myself in Redemption, just as my car's radiator decided to give up completely. The town consisted of maybe 30 buildings clustered around a main street that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s, with a general store, a single gas pump, and a hand-lettered sign that read, "Welcome to Redemption, population 127, God's country." What struck me first wasn't the isolation or the heat shimmers rising from the asphalt in the late afternoon sun, but how everyone in town seemed to know I was coming before I'd even parked my car. People emerged from buildings as I coasted to a stop near the gas pump, all of them wearing similar expressions of polite interest mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the way people look at livestock being evaluated for purchase. The mechanic who came to look at my radiator was friendly enough. A soft-spoken man named Brother Michael, who explained that they'd need to order parts from Phoenix, and it might take a few days to arrive. But not to worry because the town had plenty of hospitality for stranded travelers. "The Lord provides," he said. And the way he said it made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't quite articulate. They put me up in what they called the guest house, a small adobe building behind the general store that was clean and comfortable, but had no telephone and windows that didn't open properly. The meals were simple but well prepared, served in a communal dining room where everyone sat together and held hands, while Brother Samuel, who seemed to be the town's spiritual leader, led prayers that went on longer than seemed necessary and included frequent references to purification and the chosen ones, and those who have been called to serve. At first, I attributed the religious intensity to small-town fundamentalism, the kind of isolated community faith you sometimes encounter in rural areas where church and social life are inseparably intertwined. But by the second day, I began noticing things that troubled me more deeply than mere religious fervor could explain. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room, only to resume in hushed tones after I'd passed by. The fact that no one in town seemed to have last names, referring to each other only as brother this and sister that, even the children. The complete absence of any outside communication, no television, no radio, no internet, no newspapers. As if the town existed in perfect isolation from the rest of the world. When I asked about calling my family to let them know I'd be delayed, Brother Samuel explained that they preferred to maintain separation from the corrupted world beyond their borders, and that my presence among them was clearly part of God's plan. The third night, they invited me to attend what they called a testimony meeting in the town's small church. And that's when I realized I wasn't dealing with ordinary religious enthusiasm. The service began normally enough with hymns and prayers, but gradually evolved into something much darker as individual members stood to confess sins and declare their readiness for purification. The testimonies became increasingly bizarre. People confessing to crimes they couldn't possibly have committed, describing visions of angels and demons, speaking in tongues while others interpreted their babbling as divine messages. Brother Samuel presided over it all, with an intensity that bordered on the manic, his eyes bright with the kind of fervor that makes people dangerous. When they called me forward to give my own testimony, to confess my sins and accept purification, I knew I had to play along to avoid immediate suspicion. I spoke vaguely about being lost and finding direction, about seeking meaning in my life, about being grateful for their hospitality. But Brother Samuel wasn't satisfied with generalities. Yes, he wanted specifics, wanted me to confess particular sins, wanted me to name people I'd harmed and ways I'd served the devil in the outside world. The congregation pressed closer around me, their faces expectant and hungry. And I realized that this wasn't just religious theater. They were evaluating me for something, testing my suitability for some purpose that remained hidden but felt increasingly sinister. That's when I noticed the photographs on the church wall behind the altar. Dozens of pictures of people who looked like they'd been taken in the same desert setting. Men and women of various ages, all wearing expressions of peaceful acceptance. All posed in ways that suggested they weren't entirely voluntary subjects. Some of the faces looked familiar, like people I might have seen in missing person reports on highway billboards or milk cartons. But the photos were too old and faded to be certain. Brother Samuel caught me staring at them and explained that these were the blessed ones who had completed their journey. People who had achieved perfect purification and now served as examples for others to follow. After the service, I was escorted back to the guest house by two men who no longer bothered to maintain the pretense of friendliness, and I heard the distinct sound of a lock engaging after they closed the door behind them. Through my window, I could see people moving through the town with purpose, carrying what looked like tools and supplies, preparing for something that was scheduled to happen soon. I found a loose floorboard in the guest house and discovered a cache of personal belongings that clearly didn't belong to current residents. Driver's licenses, credit cards, jewelry, and cell phones from people with names like Jennifer Martinez and David Thompson and Sarah Chen, all items that suggested previous guests who had never completed their planned journeys home. The escape came during what they called the cleansing ceremony the next evening, when the entire population gathered in the desert outside town to participate in rituals that involved fire and chanting and the systematic destruction of worldly possessions. And in the chaos and darkness, with everyone's attention focused on the ceremony, I managed to break out of the guest house and make it to where they'd hidden my car behind the general store. The engine turned over on the third try, and I drove without headlights until I was far enough from redemption to risk being seen, then pushed the Honda as hard as it would go toward the interstate and the safety of populated areas. But they'd found me anyway, somehow tracking me across hundreds of miles of desert highway until this state trooper with a vacant stare pulled me over on a lonely stretch of road where no one would witness what happened next. As he approached my car, I could see other vehicles emerging from hiding places along the roadside. The same dusty pickups and SUVs I'd seen parked around Redemption, carrying the same people who'd smiled at me so benevolently while planning my purification. The trooper's badge looked real enough, but his uniform was wrong somehow. Too clean for someone working Arizona highways, and when he reached for his radio to call in my license plate, I knew he was reporting my location to Brother Samuel rather than to any legitimate law enforcement dispatcher. The truck driver hadn't moved from behind the wheel of his 18-wheeler in over 45 minutes. Not to stretch, not to check his cargo, not even to use the restroom facilities at the Pilot Travel Center where we'd both stopped off exit 126 on Interstate 44, just east of Lebanon, Missouri. What made his stillness even more unsettling was the way his rig sat perfectly positioned in the back corner of the lot. Diesel engine still running, sending steady exhaust into the cool October air, while every other driver who'd parked here tonight had shut down their engines and gone inside for coffee, showers, or sleep. Look, I've been driving professionally for 12 years now, hauling everything from auto parts to frozen foods across 38 states. And you develop instincts about people and situations that keep you alive out here on the highways. Something about this particular driver felt wrong from the moment I'd pulled into the truck stop and noticed his cab. A pristine Peterbilt with custom paintwork that must have cost more than most people make in a year, but with license plates that looked freshly issued and temporary tags hanging in the rear window. Professional drivers don't usually run temporary tags on rigs that expensive. And they sure don't sit motionless in truck stop parking lots for nearly an hour without getting out to do something productive. I'd been making decent time on my run from Kansas City to Memphis when fatigue started hitting me hard around Springfield. That familiar, heavy feeling behind my eyes that tells you it's time to park it before you become a statistic on some DOT accident report. The Pilot at Lebanon is one of my regular stops. A clean facility with good food and adequate parking that draws the kind of professional drivers who take care of their equipment and don't cause trouble for other folks trying to make an honest living. Most nights, you'll find the usual mix of owner-operators and company drivers grabbing showers, doing their logbook updates, or catching a few hours of mandatory rest before pushing on toward their destinations. But tonight felt different somehow. Maybe because of the unseasonably cool weather or the fact that business had been slow lately, and a lot of regular drivers were taking time off between loads. The parking area was only about half full, which made the mysterious Peterbilt even more noticeable sitting there by itself in the shadows beyond the reach of the overhead sodium lights. I'd been keeping an eye on it through my windshield while I updated my electronic logs and ate a microwave burrito from the travel store. And in all that time, I hadn't seen so much as a flicker of movement from the driver's seat. The really strange part was how perfectly positioned the truck was, backed into the parking space with military precision, giving the driver a clear view of every vehicle that entered or left the lot, while remaining far enough from the building to avoid the foot traffic of drivers coming and going from the facilities. It was the kind of parking job you'd use if you were conducting surveillance or waiting for something specific to happen, not the casual arrangement most drivers use when they're just looking for a place to grab some rest. The more I watched, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just another trucker taking a break. I decided to walk over and check on the driver, telling myself it was just professional courtesy. Sometimes guys have medical emergencies or equipment problems and need assistance, but are too proud or too sick to ask for help. The walk across the parking lot felt longer than it should have. Maybe because I was walking away from the well-lit areas near the building and into the darker section where the mysterious truck was parked. As I got closer, I could see that the cab's interior lights were off, making it impossible to see clearly inside. But the engine's steady rumble confirmed that someone was definitely still in there. When I reached the driver's side of the Peterbilt, I knocked on the door and called out, "Hey, driver, everything okay in there?" The response wasn't what I expected. Instead of the usual acknowledgement or invitation to talk, I heard what sounded like rapid shuffling movements inside the cab, followed by complete silence except for the engine's idle. The movements had been too quick and too deliberate to be someone just waking up from sleep, more like someone scrambling to hide something or get into a different position. I knocked again, louder this time, and identified myself as a fellow professional driver, but got no response at all. That's when I noticed the smell. Something organic and unpleasant that seemed to be coming from the trailer rather than the cab. A sweet, cloying odor that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. Most refrigerated trailers smell like diesel fuel and machinery, sometimes with traces of whatever they're hauling. But this was different. More pungent and definitely not something you'd associate with legitimate cargo. I walked back along the length of the trailer, trying to identify the source of the smell, and noticed that the rear doors weren't properly sealed. There was a gap of maybe half an inch that shouldn't have been there if the trailer was maintaining proper temperature for refrigerated goods. The smell was definitely stronger near the rear doors, and I could hear what sounded like a low humming or buzzing sound coming from inside the trailer. Like electrical equipment running or maybe ventilation fans that weren't working properly. But refrigerated trailers don't usually make those kinds of sounds unless something's wrong with the cooling system. And if the cooling system was malfunctioning, any legitimate driver would be on his radio or phone trying to get emergency service to prevent his cargo from spoiling. The fact that this driver was just sitting motionless in his cab, while his trailer potentially suffered mechanical problems, made no sense from a professional standpoint. I was starting to back away from the trailer when I heard a new sound from inside. Unthinkable, not mechanical this time, but something that might have been organic, like movement or maybe voices, though too muffled to make out clearly. The sound came in irregular intervals, sometimes quiet, sometimes more intense, and it didn't match the steady rhythm you'd expect from malfunctioning equipment. I pressed my ear closer to the gap in the rear doors, trying to determine if someone inside might need help. And what I heard made my blood run cold. It sounded like multiple voices having a conversation, but too quiet and too distorted to understand the words. The smart thing would have been to walk away right then, to go back to my own truck and mind my own business like most drivers do when they encounter something that doesn't concern them directly. But something about the whole situation felt wrong enough that I couldn't just ignore it. The mysterious driver who wouldn't respond to knocks, the improperly sealed trailer with the strange smell, the sounds that suggested people might be trapped inside. I walked around to the front of the Peterbilt and tried to see through the windshield, but the cab's curtains were drawn, and the angle made it impossible to see inside clearly. When I returned to my own truck to consider my options, I noticed that the mysterious Peterbilt had changed position slightly. It was now angled differently in its parking space, as if it had been moved just enough to get a better view of my truck or to position itself for a quick departure. The movement had been so subtle that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been paying close attention. But it confirmed that someone was definitely awake and alert inside that cab, watching my movements and reacting to my interest in their operation. That's when I decided to call the Missouri State Police and report what I'd observed. Describing the location, the truck's appearance, and the suspicious circumstances without making any specific accusations. The dispatcher took my information professionally and said they'd send a trooper to check on the situation, but warned me that it might take 30 to 40 minutes for someone to arrive since most units were tied up with a multi-vehicle accident on I-44 west of Springfield. As I waited for law enforcement to arrive, I kept watching the mysterious truck from my cab. And about 20 minutes after I'd made the call, the Peterbilt's engine note changed from idle to driving RPM, and the truck pulled out of its parking space and headed for the exit without stopping at the fuel pumps or the building. My wife disappeared somewhere between mile marker 83 and mile marker 97 on Pennsylvania State Route 6. And I know those exact markers because I've driven that 14-mile stretch of highway approximately 237 times in the past 8 months, searching for any clue about what happened to Sarah on that foggy October morning when she never arrived at her sister's house in Wellsboro. The Pennsylvania State Police closed her case after 6 weeks, officially classifying her disappearance as a voluntary missing person situation. But they never found her car, never located her cell phone. and never explained how someone simply vanishes on a rural highway, where the only turnoffs lead to dead-end logging roads and abandoned hunting camps. I need to be precise about this, because precision is all I have left now. Facts, measurements, documented evidence that something extraordinary happened on that stretch of Route 6 that cuts through the Tioga State Forest between Gallatin and Wellsboro. Sarah left our house in State College at 7:15 a.m. on October 23rd, driving her silver 2019 Honda Accord with Pennsylvania license plate HBJ 4829, carrying an overnight bag and the apple pie she'd baked for her sister's birthday celebration. The drive should have taken approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes, putting her arrival time at Rebecca's house around 9:35 a.m. But Rebecca called me at 11:45 a.m. asking where Sarah was, because she hadn't shown up and wasn't answering her phone. Route 6, through that section of north-central Pennsylvania, is what locals call the loneliest highway. A 2-lane road that follows ridgelines and creek valleys through dense hardwood forest that stretches unbroken for miles in every direction. During peak foliage season in October, the road attracts leaf peepers and photographers. But on weekday mornings, it carries mostly local traffic. Loggers heading to work sites and the occasional long-haul trucker using it as a shortcut between Williamsport and Corning. Cell phone coverage is spotty at best, with dead zones that can last for 20 or 30 miles. And GPS devices frequently lose satellite connection in the valleys where the forest canopy blocks the sky. When Sarah didn't answer her phone by noon, I called the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks in Mansfield and reported her overdue, providing details about her route, her vehicle, and her destination. The desk sergeant took the information professionally, but explained that adults have the right to change their plans without notifying anyone, and they couldn't officially classify someone as missing until they'd been unaccounted for 24 hours. But he assured me they'd alert patrol units to watch for her vehicle. And he suggested I drive the route myself to check for signs of mechanical problems or accidents that might not have been reported yet. I made my first search run that afternoon, driving slowly from Gallatin to Wellsboro and back, stopping at every business and residence along the way to ask if anyone had seen a silver Honda Accord or woman matching Sarah's description. The few people I found at home were helpful, but hadn't noticed anything unusual. And the gas stations and convenience stores I checked had no record of her stopping for fuel or using their restrooms. I examined every turnoff, every pullover area, every spot where a car might have left the pavement, but found no tire tracks, no broken guardrails, no evidence that any vehicle had departed the highway involuntarily. The Pennsylvania State Police conducted their own investigation over the following weeks, interviewing Sarah's family and friends, examining her financial records and digital footprint, checking surveillance cameras at businesses along possible routes she might have taken. They found no evidence of marital problems, financial stress, mental health issues, or any other factors that might explain a voluntary disappearance. Sarah's bank accounts remained untouched, her credit cards unused, her social media accounts inactive. She had simply vanished as completely as if she'd never existed, leaving behind no trace except the absence of her presence in my life, and the growing certainty that something unnatural had occurred on that stretch of highway. That's when I began my systematic search pattern, driving Route 6 between mile markers 83 and 97 at different times of day and in different weather conditions, documenting everything I observed with photographs, GPS coordinates, and detailed written notes. I mapped every logging road, every hunting trail, every abandoned structure within 5 miles of the highway, exploring each one on foot when necessary to ensure that Sarah's car wasn't hidden in the forest where aerial searches might have missed it. I interviewed hunters, fishermen, hikers, and local residents, building a database of everyone who regularly traveled through that area and might have witnessed something unusual on October 23rd or in the days following Sarah's disappearance. What I discovered during these investigations was a pattern of anomalies that the official investigation had overlooked or dismissed. Between 1987 and the present, 17 people had disappeared along that 14-mile stretch of Route 6. All of them traveling alone, all of them during daylight hours, all of them leaving behind no physical evidence of what had happened to them. The disappearances occurred at irregular intervals, sometimes years apart, sometimes within months of each other. But they followed consistent characteristics that suggested something more than random misfortune or individual decisions to start new lives elsewhere. The local residents I interviewed were reluctant to discuss the disappearances directly, but many of them acknowledged that strange things happened along that section of highway, particularly in the area around Pine Creek Gorge, where the road runs along the edge of a deep ravine known locally as the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon. Some mentioned unusual weather patterns, sudden fog banks that appeared without meteorological explanation, temperature drops that occurred on clear, warm days, electromagnetic disturbances that affected radio reception and cell phone signals. Others described wildlife behavior that didn't match normal patterns. Deer and other animals avoiding the area during certain times of year, birds refusing to nest in trees near the highway, domestic animals becoming agitated when traveling through the region. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that Sarah's disappearance was connected to whatever phenomenon was responsible for the other missing persons cases along Route 6. I contacted families of previous victims and found that their stories matched Sarah's almost exactly. Ordinary people making routine trips who simply never arrived at their destinations, leaving behind no evidence of mechanical failure, accident, or voluntary departure. Most of these families had conducted their own investigations, driven the same roads repeatedly, asked the same questions, and reached the same frustrating conclusion that official law enforcement either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge the pattern. On my 183rd search run, I experienced something that changed my understanding of what had happened to Sarah and the others. I was driving eastbound toward Wellsboro around 9 a.m. on a clear morning in June, when I encountered a fog bank that hadn't been visible from a distance and didn't appear on any weather radar I checked later. The fog was so dense that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet, forcing me to slow to a crawl and navigate by the center line and guardrail reflectors. But the strangest part wasn't the fog itself. It was the way time seemed to stretch inside it, the way my car's electronic systems malfunctioned, the way I could hear voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, and the way I emerged from the fog bank to discover that I had somehow traveled nearly 50 miles without any memory of the intervening distance. When I stopped to get my bearings, I realized I was parked at the same rest area where Sarah would have stopped if she'd needed to use facilities or make a phone call during her trip to Wellsboro. The rest area showed no signs of recent maintenance. The picnic tables were weathered and broken, the restroom building was boarded up, and weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt. But according to PennDOT records, the facility had been closed for renovations only 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance. As I sat there trying to understand what had happened to me during those missing miles, I found a cell phone lying in the tall grass near the abandoned restroom building, and when I turned it on, the last number dialed was Rebecca's house in Wellsboro, called at 9:27 a.m. on October 23rd. The children appeared in my headlights at exactly 11:47 p.m. on Oregon State Route 1001. 3 small figures standing motionless in the center of the northbound lane, about 2 miles south of the abandoned city limits. What made the sight so terrifying wasn't just their sudden appearance on a stretch of coastal highway where no houses were visible for miles, but the fact that they didn't react to my approaching headlights the way living children would. No startled movement, no attempt to get out of the road, No acknowledgement of the 2-ton vehicle bearing down on them at 45 miles per hour. I've driven this stretch of Highway 101 probably 1,000 times over the past 15 years, making the run between my home in Coos Bay and my mother's assisted living facility in Gold Beach every other weekend to help with her medical appointments and grocery shopping. The route takes you through some of the most spectacular coastal scenery in Oregon, but at night it becomes a different creature entirely. A narrow ribbon of asphalt that hugs cliffsides and threads through dense forests of Sitka spruce and shore pine, with the Pacific Ocean churning invisibly in the darkness beyond the guardrail. On a clear night, you might catch glimpses of fishing boat lights far offshore. But when the marine layer rolls in, as it had that particular evening, visibility drops to whatever your headlights can illuminate in the wall of gray fog. I slammed on my brakes so hard that my seatbelt locked and my coffee cup went flying, the Honda Civic skidding to a stop maybe 20 feet from where the children stood in the road. They appeared to be between 8 and 12 years old. 2 girls and a boy, wearing clothing that looked somehow old-fashioned, even in the brief glimpse I'd gotten. The kind of simple dresses and knickers that kids might have worn decades ago. They stood perfectly still in formation, as if they were posing for a photograph or participating in some kind of ceremony that required absolute motionlessness. The fog swirled around them, but didn't seem to obscure their forms the way it affected everything else in my headlight beams. My first instinct was to get out of the car and check if they were injured or lost. But something about the scene held me frozen behind the wheel with the engine running, and my hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to leave marks in the vinyl. The children's faces were visible in the headlight glare. But their expressions were wrong somehow. Too calm for kids standing in the middle of a highway at nearly midnight, too focused on something beyond my car rather than on the immediate danger of the situation. They weren't looking at me or at my vehicle. They were staring past me down the road toward Bandon, with the kind of intense concentration that suggests they were waiting for something specific to happen. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that these were real children who needed help, maybe victims of a car accident or runaways who'd gotten lost in the fog and ended up wandering onto the highway. But the deeper, more primitive part of my mind was screaming warnings I couldn't ignore. The same instincts that keep animals away from dangerous situations they can't understand, but somehow recognize as threats. These children weren't behaving like any living kids I'd ever encountered. And the longer I sat there watching them, the more convinced I became that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. I tried honking my horn to get their attention, but the sound seemed to die in the fog, without carrying the way it should have, producing only a muffled note that felt flat and ineffective. The children didn't react to the noise at all, maintaining their rigid poses in the center of the road as if they hadn't heard anything. I flashed my high beams on and off several times, but again got no response. And I began to notice that the fog around them seemed to be moving in patterns that didn't match the gentle breeze I could feel through my partially open window. That's when I remembered the stories I'd heard over the years from other locals who regularly traveled this stretch of highway. Tales of unexplained sightings and encounters that most people dismissed as fog-induced hallucinations or the overactive imaginations of tired drivers. But the stories always included certain consistent details. Children seen standing in the road at night, always in groups of 3, always wearing old-fashioned clothing, always appearing in the same general area between Bandon and the Coquille River mouth. The accounts went back decades, with some of the older fishermen and logging truck drivers claiming their fathers and grandfathers had reported similar encounters. According to local folklore, the children were connected to a tragedy that had occurred sometime in the 1920s or 1930s, when a family traveling south from Portland had been caught in a winter storm and taken shelter in their automobiles somewhere along this section of highway. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but the basic narrative remained consistent. The parents had died of carbon monoxide poisoning while keeping the car running for warmth, and the 3 children had wandered out into the storm and perished from exposure before help could arrive. Their bodies were supposedly found days later by a logging crew, but some versions of the story claimed the children's remains were never recovered. I'd always dismissed these stories as typical rural legend material, the kind of tales that grow and evolve in isolated communities where entertainment options are limited and long winter nights encourage storytelling. But sitting in my car on Highway 101 with 3 motionless children blocking my path, I found myself reconsidering everything I'd heard about this stretch of road. The children's clothing certainly matched the time period described in the stories, and their behavior was exactly what you might expect from spirits trapped in the confusion and disorientation of their final moments. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, the children began moving, but not in any way that seemed natural or human. Instead of walking, they seemed to glide backwards off the roadway, maintaining their rigid postures while somehow traveling in reverse toward the ocean side of the highway. The fog swirled more intensely as they moved, creating patterns that resembled faces and reaching hands. And I could hear what sounded like voices calling out in distress, though the words were too faint and distorted to understand clearly. As the children disappeared into the wall of fog beyond the guardrail, I felt a sudden temperature drop inside my car that made my breath visible, despite the fact that I hadn't turned off the heater. The radio, which had been playing classic rock at low volume, started cycling through stations on its own, producing bursts of static mixed with fragments of what sounded like old-time music and news broadcasts from decades past. My cell phone, which had shown 2 bars of signal just minutes earlier, now displayed no service and refused to power on when I tried to restart it. I sat there for several more minutes, engine running, heater blasting, waiting for my hands to stop shaking enough to safely continue driving. When I finally put the car in gear and crept forward through the fog, I drove slowly and carefully, constantly scanning the road ahead for any sign of the children or other obstacles. But the highway remained empty all the way to Gold Beach. And by the time I reached my mother's facility, the fog had lifted and my phone was working normally again. I never told her or anyone else about what I'd seen that night, partly because I wasn't sure I believed it myself, and partly because some experiences feel too personal and too strange to share with people who weren't there. But every time I drive that stretch of Highway 101 now, especially on foggy nights, I find myself slowing down and watching the road more carefully, wondering if those 3 children are still out there waiting for someone to help them find their way home, or if they're trying to warn other travelers about dangers that exist in the space between the living world and whatever comes after, where the rules we understand don't always apply and the past refuses to stay buried in the coastal mists of the Oregon night. My transmission gave out at the worst possible place it could have chosen. Mile marker 247 on Louisiana State Route 82. Deep in the Atchafalaya Basin, where the road runs like a concrete thread through a maze of cypress swamps and Spanish moss that blocks out most of the sky even at midday. The engine was still running fine, but when I pressed the gas pedal, nothing happened except a grinding sound that told me I wasn't going anywhere under my own power. And my cell phone showed absolutely no signal in this godforsaken stretch of wetland that looks more like the end of the world than any place people are supposed to live. You have to understand something about Route 82 through the Atchafalaya. It's not like other highways where you break down and walk to the nearest exit or flag down help from passing motorists. This is a raised roadway that cuts through 26 miles of swampland between Morgan City and Burrick, with nothing but water, cypress trees, and alligators on both sides of the asphalt. The road sits on concrete pillars maybe 10 feet above the water level, and there's nowhere to go except straight ahead or straight back. Assuming you can manage either direction on foot in the Louisiana heat and humidity that makes breathing feel like drowning in warm soup. I'd driven this route dozens of times over the years, hauling equipment between oilfield service companies. But I'd never appreciated how isolated and vulnerable you become when your vehicle stops working in the middle of all that primeval wilderness. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read 94 degrees, but with the humidity, it felt closer to 110, and I could already feel sweat soaking through my work shirt as I sat there trying to figure out my options. Behind me, the road stretched back toward Morgan City, about 12 miles through heat shimmer and Spanish moss, while ahead it continued toward Berwick for maybe 14 more miles of the same endless swamp. No other vehicles were visible in either direction, which wasn't unusual for mid-afternoon on a weekday. But it meant I might be waiting hours before someone came along who could help or at least carry a message to civilization. I tried the engine again, hoping maybe the transmission would catch if I gave it time to cool down, but got the same grinding noise and the same complete lack of forward momentum. The smell of overheated metal was starting to drift through the air conditioning vents, and I knew I was looking at a major mechanical failure that couldn't be fixed with roadside repairs. My truck was going to need a tow, probably to a transmission shop in Morgan City, and the cost was going to eat up most of what I'd planned to make on this job. But first, I had to find a way to contact someone with a phone that actually worked. That's when I noticed the boat. It was drifting slowly through the cypress trees about 100 yards off the north side of the highway, moving without any visible means of propulsion through water that looked black as coffee in the shade of the forest canopy. From my elevated position on the roadway, I could see that it was an aluminum fishing boat, maybe 14 feet long, with a single occupant sitting motionless in the stern. The person appeared to be an older man, wearing dark clothing, but the distance and the play of shadows made it difficult to make out details. What struck me as odd was how the boat maintained its steady drift through the trees without the man making any effort to steer or control its direction. I got out of my truck and walked to the guardrail, hoping to get the boatman's attention and maybe ask if he had a way to contact help or could carry a message to someone who did. "Hey," I called out, waving my arms to make myself more visible against the concrete and steel of the highway structure. "Hey, over here." But the figure in the boat didn't react, didn't turn his head or acknowledge my presence in any way. The boat continued its silent drift through the cypress grove, weaving between the massive tree trunks with an almost supernatural ability to avoid obstacles without any apparent guidance from its occupant. I walked along the guardrail, following the boat's progress and continuing to call out, but got no response from the motionless figure. As I watched, I began to notice other details that troubled me. The man's posture was too rigid, too perfectly still for someone sitting in a drifting boat on uneven water. He sat upright with his hands resting on his knees, facing straight ahead, never shifting position or making the small adjustments that living people make automatically to maintain balance. His clothing looked old-fashioned somehow, like work clothes from decades past, and his skin had a waxy, grayish color that might have been a trick of the light filtering through the Spanish moss, but seemed wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The boat itself was in remarkably good condition for something that appeared to be drifting abandoned through a swamp. There was no visible damage to the hull, no accumulated debris from floating through the forest, no evidence of the wear and weathering you'd expect from a vessel that had been adrift for any length of time. But there was also no motor, no oars, no fishing equipment, no cooler or tackle box or any of the gear that would normally be found in a boat being used for legitimate purposes. It was as if the boat and its occupant existed solely to drift through the cypress groves, serving some purpose that had nothing to do with transportation or recreation. I followed the boat for maybe a quarter-mile along the highway, calling out periodically and getting no response, until it disappeared behind a particularly dense grove of cypress trees and Spanish moss. I waited for it to emerge on the other side, but it never did, as if it had simply vanished into the shadows of the swamp forest. The silence that followed was complete, except for the distant sound of my truck's engine cooling down and the occasional splash of something moving in the water beneath the highway. Alligators, probably, or maybe large fish, but possibly something else that I preferred not to think about. Standing there in the oppressive heat with sweat running down my face and no prospect of rescue visible in either direction, I began to understand why people who work in the oil fields and chemical plants along the Louisiana coast tell stories about the Atchafalaya Basin that have nothing to do with wildlife or industrial accidents. There's something about this landscape that feels fundamentally different from other places, older and more primitive, as if the normal rules of civilization don't quite apply once you get deep enough into the wetlands. The Spanish moss hanging from every tree creates a perpetual twilight, even in the middle of the day. And the water that surrounds the roadway is dark enough to hide anything that might be moving beneath the surface. I was still standing at the guardrail, scanning the water for any sign of the mysterious boat or its occupant, when I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. A pickup truck was coming from the direction of Berwick, the first traffic I'd seen in over an hour, and I hurried back to my disabled vehicle to flag down the driver. The truck slowed as it approached, and the driver, a middle-aged Cajun man with graying hair and concerned eyes, rolled down his window to ask if I needed help. When I explained my situation, he nodded sympathetically and offered to give me a ride to a phone in Berwick, where I could call for a tow truck. As we drove toward town with my truck's hazard lights blinking behind us, I mentioned the strange boat and its motionless occupant to my rescuer. He was quiet for several moments before responding in the distinctive accent of South Louisiana, "You best not worry about what you see out there in the basin, friend. Some things been drifting through these waters a long time, and they ain't got nothing to do with the living world. Long as you stay on the highway and don't go looking for trouble in the swamp, you'll be fine. But don't go expecting answers to everything you might happen to see out there, because some questions ain't meant to be asked." My family thought I was losing my mind when I told them about the highway that kept changing itself. But they weren't there at 3:30 a.m. on Colorado State Route 149, when I watched the road literally rearrange its curves and landmarks while I was driving through them. The asphalt beneath my wheels felt solid enough, and my GPS kept insisting I was still on the same highway I'd entered 6 hours earlier near South Fork. But the mile markers were counting backward, the mountain peaks had switched positions on the horizon, and I'd passed the same abandoned gas station with the "closed for repairs" sign exactly 7 times in what should have been a straight-line journey from Creede to Lake City. I should probably explain how I ended up on that particular stretch of highway in the middle of the night, because under normal circumstances, I'm the kind of person who plans routes carefully and doesn't take chances on unfamiliar roads after dark. I'd been working a construction job in Creede, an old mining town tucked into a valley in the San Juan Mountains, and I was supposed to drive back to my home base in Grand Junction on Thursday evening after we finished pouring a foundation. But the concrete delivery got delayed, and we didn't wrap up until nearly 9 p.m., which meant I was starting a 4-hour drive through mountain highways at the worst possible time. Route 149 is the only real option for getting from Creede to points north and west, a 2-lane mountain highway that winds through some of the most spectacular and isolated country in Colorado. During daylight hours, It's a scenic drive through aspen groves and alpine meadows with views of 14,000-foot peaks that make you understand why people move to Colorado despite the cost of living and the altitude headaches. But at night, especially in late September when the first winter storms are starting to build over the Continental Divide, Route 149 becomes something entirely different. A narrow ribbon of asphalt that disappears into darkness on both sides, with drop-offs that you can sense but not see, and weather that can change from clear to blizzard conditions in the time it takes to drive 10 miles. The first sign that something was wrong came around mile marker 67, about 20 miles northeast of Creed, when I noticed that the odometer in my pickup truck had stopped advancing even though I was maintaining a steady 50 miles per hour and the engine was running normally. I thought maybe it was a mechanical glitch, some kind of electrical problem that would resolve itself. But when I checked again, after what felt like another 20 minutes of driving, the odometer reading was identical and my fuel gauge hadn't moved either, which shouldn't have been possible given the rate at which my old Ford normally consumed gas. That's when I started paying closer attention to the mile markers, and I realized they weren't following the normal sequence. Instead of counting up as I drove northeast toward Lake City, they seemed to be jumping around randomly, sometimes increasing by 10 or 15 miles between markers, sometimes decreasing, sometimes repeating numbers I'd already passed. Mile marker 67 appeared 3 different times over what should have been a 40-mile stretch of highway, and each time it looked exactly the same, positioned next to the same cluster of aspen trees and the same distinctive rock formation that jutted up from the valley floor. The abandoned gas station first appeared around what my GPS claimed was mile marker 78, a single-story concrete block building with 2 ancient pumps and a hand-painted sign that read, "Mountain View Service, closed for repairs," in faded red letters. The building sat in a wide spot in the road that might have been an official turnout or just a place where the highway construction had created extra space, surrounded by the kind of high-altitude scrub brush and scattered boulders that characterize the landscape above 10,000 feet elevation. I slowed down as I passed it, thinking I might stop and try to get better cell phone reception, but decided to push on toward Lake City instead. But 20 minutes later, I passed the same gas station again, in exactly the same location relative to the distinctive rock formations and aspen groves that served as landmarks in the darkness. This time, I pulled over and got out of the truck to examine the building more closely, thinking maybe there were similar structures along the highway that I'd confused in the dark. But the details were identical. The same "closed for repairs" sign in the same faded red paint, the same crack in the concrete foundation, the same broken window on the north side of the building. I tried calling my supervisor to report that I was running late, but my cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in the mountains, but added to my growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with this drive. The GPS continued to show my position on Route 149, but the estimated arrival time in Lake City kept jumping around, sometimes showing 45 minutes remaining, sometimes 2 hours, sometimes displaying error messages that suggested the device couldn't establish a clear fix on my location. The radio picked up only static on every frequency. Not even the emergency broadcast stations that usually come through clearly in rural areas. By the 4th time, I passed the Mountain View service station. I was certain that I was somehow caught in a loop, driving the same section of highway repeatedly without making any progress toward my destination. But the really disturbing part was how the landscape kept changing between passes. Subtle alterations that I might have missed if I hadn't been paying close attention. Mountain peaks that had been visible on my left side during the first pass would appear on my right side during the 3rd pass, as if the entire highway had been rotated or reflected. Valleys that had been deep and narrow became wide and shallow, and creek beds that had been running parallel to the road would suddenly cut across it at different angles. The seventh time I encountered the gas station, I decided to stop and wait for daylight, hoping that whatever was affecting my perception or the road itself would resolve when the sun came up and I could see the landscape clearly. I parked next to the building and tried to sleep in the cab of my truck. But every time I started to doze off, I would hear the sound of vehicles passing on the highway. Not the normal whoosh of cars and trucks moving at highway speeds, but something slower and more deliberate, like heavy machinery or construction equipment operating at very low speeds in the darkness. When I finally got out to look, there was nothing on the road, no vehicles visible in either direction, and no recent tire tracks in the light coating of dust that covered the asphalt. But the sound continued periodically throughout the night, sometimes approaching from the direction of Creed, sometimes from the Lake City direction, but never producing any visible source or leaving any evidence of passage. As dawn finally began to break over the mountains, revealing the familiar landscape of the San Juan Range in its proper configuration, I found myself parked at a legitimate rest area 15 miles past Lake City. With no memory of how I'd gotten there and no explanation for what had happened during those lost hours on a highway that seemed to exist in its own space and time. These stories represent just a fraction of the terrifying encounters that happen every night on America's highways, where travelers find themselves face to face with phenomena that challenge everything we think we know about reality. If you've experienced something similar on your own road trips, you're not alone, and your story matters. Subscribe to Verified Fears for more chilling accounts of true highway horror. And remember that sometimes the most dangerous thing about a long drive isn't falling asleep at the wheel, but discovering that some roads lead to places that don't exist on any map.